Well, 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 how about this? Theresa May's latest effort to secure the British Parliament's support for her withdrawal agreement from the EU has come to naught. Many of her own party's MPs voted it down. Of course, this is all just added to all the turmoil and confusion in British politics these days, with a host of people on the Remain side of the Brexit controversy demanding a second referendum to give the British people another say on whether Britain should bug out of the EU at all. But I'll tell you what. Do you know how they could have avoided a lot of these problems in the UK? If they had actually taken a page from Quebec's referendum book. And I am referring specifically to the first of the two referendums on secession from Canada that Quebec held in 1980.
Si je vous ai bien compris, vous êtes en train de dire à la prochaine fois.
May 20th, 1980, that's when the first referendum on Quebec's secession from Canada was called by Quebec's first Parti Quebecois Premier, René Lévesque. Now here's how it worked. The Parti Quebecois government approached Quebecers in a first referendum vote on May 20th, 1980, in which they asked Quebecers to give that government a mandate to negotiate Quebec's secession from Canada. Why would negotiations be necessary? Well, the PQ was offering Quebecers a rather complex deal in which they wouldn't actually go for full independence, all of the accoutrements and trappings of a country's total sovereignty. The idea was that Quebecers would continue to enjoy Canadian citizenship, would continue to use the Canadian dollar. Hopefully the government of this sovereign Quebec would actually have some seats on the board of the Bank of Canada and would therefore help participate in decisions affecting Canada's monetary policy, the value of its currency, etc. All of those details would really need to be worked out in negotiations after a referendum vote, negotiations with the Canadian government, because the consent of the Canadian government would be required to make anything like that happen. If 50% plus one of Quebec voters had in fact voted yes to giving the Quebec government that mandate to negotiate secession with Canada, then the government would have proceeded to try to open negotiations with the federal government in Ottawa.
Moi, je dis qu'il n'y a aucun risque. Et pourquoi? D'abord par la nature de la question elle-même. La nature de la question qui demande un mandat négocié qui ne sera suivi d'aucun changement sans un second référendum. Ce qui va s'ouvrir à la suite d'un oui, c'est une phase de négociation et non pas de changement.
Now, at this point, any number of things could have happened. Pierre Trudeau, who was the father of Canada's current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, he was actually giving speeches during the referendum campaign in 1980 in which he said, well, actually, we in Ottawa would not be bound to negotiate Quebec's secession from Canada simply because a majority of voters in the province vote to leave, so don't count on our cooperation. Or maybe the two parties would actually have come to some sort of agreement. Maybe the governments of the other 9 provinces of Canada would have been given some say in the matter as well, who knows? And maybe they would have arrived at some kind of tentative agreement. What then? The Parti Quebecois government would have come back to the Quebec people in a second referendum vote to vote on that final package.
Les changements ne survenant qu'après un deuxième référendum qui portera sur l'entente nouvelle qu'on aura fait avec le reste du Canada durant ces 2 ans, 3 ans de négociations. On n'est pas pressé. Ça fait 117 ans qu'on vit le même vieux régime. Ça vaut la peine, si on veut changer, de faire les choses avec grand soin. Donc 2 ou 3 ans et faire approuver par la population.
The advantage of that is that Quebecers wouldn't have been hit with any nasty surprises. Or at least the likelihood of them being hit with any nasty surprises would have been minimized. Quebecers would have known exactly what they would have been getting themselves into with as much specificity as possible before making a final decision as to whether to leave Canada or not. Why do I recommend that approach to Britain? Well, look at what's going on. They tried to resolve this issue with just one referendum, and look at what's happened. There's been all this turmoil, there's been all this uncertainty. Now there seems to be more uncertainty than ever, and the specter of what they call a no-deal Brexit is rearing its ugly head once again, and more credibly and probably than ever before. Britons just can't seem to agree. First of all, on whether to leave the UK or not, and second of all, on what terms they'd like to leave the UK under. How close a relationship do they still want to have with the member nations of the EU? How much jurisdiction are they willing to still share with the EU in certain ways? How much freedom of movement? What kind of immigration policy would they want to have? Etc., etc. The levels of support for Brexit will likely fluctuate depending on exactly what kind of deal emerges. And that could not have been predicted in advance. It could only have been known once the negotiations were underway and were completed. The negotiations could have gone in any number of different directions. British voters really should have had the opportunity to pronounce themselves on that final deal. It wouldn't be a situation like what we see today, where at least some British voters probably feel some degree of buyer's remorse, in the same way that public support for separating from Canada fluctuated in Quebec over the decades and varied widely depending on the specific nature of sovereign status and what it would have meant for Quebec and what kind of relationship Quebec would have had with Canada after secession. In the same way, support for Brexit varies to some extent in the UK depending on the precise nature and provisions and terms and conditions of the eventual agreement between Britain and the EU. Unfortunately, that's not the arrangement that David Cameron made when he agreed to call the Brexit referendum. It's too bad that Cameron didn't learn the lessons of history and wasn't willing to learn from the experience of another jurisdiction, namely Canada. The current turmoil could have been avoided or at least mitigated substantially. So, should there be a second referendum on Brexit now? I'm not so sure. The fundamental problem with trying to hold a second Brexit referendum now is that that's not what was originally promised to the British people. The British people were told by David Cameron that they would have one opportunity to vote on whether to stick around in the EU or bug out. For them to hold another Brexit referendum now would smack of sore loserdom. It would smack of pro-EU forces in Britain trying to sort of move the goalposts after the fact or change the rules in the middle of the game just to really benefit their own side and thwart their political opposition. It wouldn't have the ring of democratic legitimacy that the arrangement I'm proposing here would have had it been implemented in the first place. So, what's likely to happen in the end? I suspect that Britain and the EU are going to continue to muddle along in the current state of affairs. Other countries that are going through or considering going through their own secession exercises in the future should pay very close attention to the whole Brexit experience, as well as to the experience of Quebec and Canada. These questions of national sovereignty and identity and loyalty are best resolved with ballots rather than bullets wherever possible. The best and most responsible way to handle it in the long run, I'm not saying it's the most politically expedient thing to do, far from it, but the most responsible and the fairest way to handle it in the long run is to have 2 rounds of voting to make sure that voters get to pronounce themselves first on whether they want to enter into the whole ordeal at all in the first place, and second of all, whether they are satisfied with the end result or whether they would rather just say no to that and stick with the status quo.